This material provides a comprehensive geopolitical and economic analysis of the 2026 U.S.-Israel war on Iran, focusing heavily on the resulting Strait of Hormuz blockade and the subsequent Trump-Xi diplomatic architecture.
Right.
So, a key theme running through this material seems to be the heavy focus on the United States and China as the absolute undisputed centers of gravity in this crisis.
Yeah, the material makes a strong case for the bilateral U.S.-China dynamic by highlighting their direct negotiations, but it underestimates the crucial geopolitical realignments occurring simultaneously across the global south.
It really does. It reads as though Washington and Beijing are operating in a total vacuum.
Exactly.
I mean, the text extensively details this new hegemonic duality and Beijing's direct energy vulnerabilities like the ships trapped in the Gulf, the refineries running dry. But it fundamentally treats the rest of the world as just, passive collateral damage.
And that is precisely where the analytical lens needs to widen. The draft paints these emerging economies as mere bystanders.
Right.
It's entirely missing the fact that their shifting allegiances could actively undermine, or on the flip side, support China's overarching strategy.
So how do we fix that?
Well, the suggestion here is to expand the analytical scope to evaluate how the destabilization of these emerging economies threatens China's broader multilateral ambitions.
Especially its leadership in those coalitions designed to counter Western influence, right?
Precisely. We have to evaluate the severe political fallout of this cascading economic pain.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that fallout, because it's not just some vague economic slowdown.
No, it's very physical.
Yeah, for instance, the text mentions India's fertilizer shortage and the Philippines declaring a national energy emergency. But we need to explain exactly how these specific dominoes fall.
Absolutely.
Like India relies heavily on natural gas and urea derivatives, linked to Middle Eastern energy flows just to sustain its agricultural sector.
Right, so if Hormuz closes...
It's not just an energy inconvenience for New Delhi. It is a structural food security crisis affecting over 1 billion people.
Wow. Yeah.
And then you look at the Philippines. They rely heavily on the spot market for liquefied natural gas. They would see their grid literally shut down when global prices spike because they simply cannot outbid the Europeans or the Chinese for whatever cargo is left on the water.
And that is the exact level of granular causality the author needs to bring to the surface.
Yeah.
And then, crucially, they need to tie that physical reality back to China's strategic posture.
Okay, I see where you're going.
Building on that point, what if we looked at it from the perspective of the Caucasus border tensions mentioned in the research?
Oh, right. The Azerbaijani troops deploying toward the Iranian border.
Exactly. The author needs to specifically explore how China's failure to actively support Iran, which, let's remember, is a newly minted member of both BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
Right, a major new ally.
How that failure might completely erode Beijing's credibility as a reliable security guarantor for the global south.
Yeah, if I am a developing nation watching Iran's critical infrastructure get systematically dismantled while China simply sits back and calculates its strategic oil reserves, I'm absolutely rethinking my strategic alignment.
100%.
But let me push back here, because I want to ensure we don't drift.
Sure.
As I understand it from the notes, the argument here is squarely focused on the mechanics of the new hegemonic duality. By expanding the focus to Manila, New Delhi, or Baku, isn't there a risk of diluting the author's core thesis?
That's an interesting point.
It feels like we are asking the author to look at the audience instead of the two main grandmasters playing on the geopolitical chessboard.
Well, the thing is, in this specific game, the audience can flip the board.
Okay, fair point.
I mean, China has spent the last decade and hundreds of billions of dollars positioning itself as the undisputed champion of the developing world through the Belt and Road Initiative, BRICS expansion, and the SCO.
Right, it's their whole brand.
Yeah, their grand strategy to counter U.S. hegemony relies entirely on keeping these nations integrated within their economic and diplomatic orbit.
Okay, so what I really like about this part is that the argument isn't just that the global south is hurting. It is that their physical pain is a direct existential threat to China's architectural power.
Precisely. If the global south's economies melt down because of a conflict China refuses to intervene in, the entire diplomatic coalition Xi Jinping has painstakingly built begins to fracture.
That makes a lot of sense.
The author has a tremendous opportunity here to elevate the analysis by demonstrating how this intense bilateral standoff creates multilateral shockwaves that actually force Beijing's hand.
That structural reliance on the global south is a brilliant pivot. And building directly on this idea of cascading economic pain,
we really need to critically examine how this global shock uniquely impacts China's domestic economy versus the West's.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the threshold for pain is vastly different, and that changes the entire dynamic of the standoff.
Right, the geopolitical assessment effectively outlines China's direct energy liabilities, yet it overlooks the strategic asymmetric leverage Beijing gains from the West's concurrent economic strain.
Yeah, the draft kind of loses some momentum there.
It does. The analysis frames the Strait of Hormuz closure primarily as a devastating crisis for China. It heavily cites the trapped tankers in the loss of 1.4 million barrels a day of Iranian imports, but it misses the critical argument that China's massive strategic reserves and its domestic deflationary environment actually insulate it far better than Western economies.
Which are actively battling severe cost-push inflation.
Exactly.
It's a glaring omission when you look at the mechanics of it. The text treats the loss of those barrels as an absolute, isolated vulnerability for Beijing.
Right.
But vulnerability is always relative in a geopolitical negotiation.
It absolutely is. So the suggestion here is to reframe China's energy situation as a comparative geopolitical advantage rather than just a massive liability.
Okay?
The author should systematically demonstrate how Beijing can weaponize its structural economic resilience to extract major concessions from Washington during this crisis.
Let's break down the transmission mechanisms of that economic resilience so the author can see exactly how to execute this reframing.
Sure.
We are talking about contrasting how the shock travels through different economic engines. In the US and Europe, you have deeply entrenched inflationary pressures. If Hormuz closes, Europe is staring down another 2.5% or 3% inflation spike almost overnight.
Which is devastating.
And in the US, Treasury yields would skyrocket, restricting the Fed's ability to stabilize debt, and you would see US gasoline hitting $4, maybe $5 a gallon almost immediately.
And that translates to acute, immediate political paralysis.
Right.
Now contrast that with the mechanics of the Chinese economy in 2026. China is operating with a massive deflationary buffer.
Yeah, they have a totally different setup.
Right. Their factories have overcapacity. Domestic consumer demand is relatively suppressed, and wage growth is flat. When a massive energy price shock hits a deflationary environment, it acts somewhat like a shock absorber.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
It certainly hurts corporate margins and slows industrial output, but it doesn't immediately trigger the kind of spiraling cost of living crisis that topples governments in the West.
Plus, they are sitting on a 1.3 to 1.4 billion barrel strategic petroleum reserve.
Massive stockpiles.
They literally have the physical buffer to wait out the initial panic. So the author could show how Xi Jinping might leverage this relative domestic stability, this asymmetric pain threshold, to stall negotiations.
Exactly.
He could use it to force U.S. concessions on the reciprocal trade framework, or, more critically, use the leverage to stall Taiwan arms sales during the May 2026 summit. China can afford to let the clock run out on the blockade longer than the U.S. consumer can.
The timeline of the pain is the mechanism of the leverage.
But I have to challenge this, because we have to ensure the logic holds up across the entire manuscript.
Okay, hit me.
As I understand it from the notes, the argument here is that China's deflationary state and lack of wage growth is an economic fragility of its own.
Right, it is.
They desperately rely on export markets. If the US and Europe enter a deep inflationary recession because of this blockade, demand for Chinese exports completely collapses. How can the author balance these two realities? China's insulation from inflation, but vulnerability to a drop in global consumer demand, without contradicting their own argument.
Yeah. Is there a risk that focusing solely on China's reserves might overlook the catastrophic demand-side collapse?
Yes, absolutely.
So how do we fix it?
Well, the author resolves this apparent contradiction by explaining the differing timelines of political accountability.
The ballot box versus the trailing indicator.
Precisely. Cost-push inflation in the United States hits the ballot box immediately. It craters consumer sentiment today.
Yeah, people notice gas prices right away.
Exactly. A massive spike at the gas pump translates to a political crisis for the White House within weeks. But China's vulnerability to a drop in global consumer demand is a trailing indicator.
It takes time to filter through. Right. The collapse in export orders hurts, and it threatens social stability eventually. but that true systemic pain really materializes 6 to 12 months down the line.
So, in a game of geopolitical chicken, the side whose political and economic system insulates them from immediate, day zero public backlash holds the asymmetric leverage.
Exactly.
That makes perfect sense, and it is a brilliant way to structure the argument without ignoring China's long-term fragility.
Yeah, the pain threshold is simply different.
Now, that relative economic leverage doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is entirely dictated by who controls the physical mechanisms enforcing the standoff.
Right.
Let's look closely at the section discussing the 2025 rare earth export restrictions.
The material details the weaponization of trade brilliantly, but the connection between the maritime choke point in the Middle East and the ongoing rare earth minerals war remains largely disjointed.
It really does feel disconnected.
Yeah. The core weakness here is that the text treats the 2025 Chinese rare earth export restrictions and the 2026 Strait of Hormuz blockade as parallel but isolated events.
Yeah, I noticed that structural disconnect as well.
It reads somewhat like a chronological history book, moving from one year to the next, failing to synthesize these events into a unified theory of modern choke point warfare that defines this new hegemonic duality.
We get a deep dive into the semiconductor and rare earth clashes of 2025, detailing how Beijing throttled the export of critical minerals. Then, we literally turn the page, and suddenly we are 100% focused on maritime security, carrier strike groups, and oil in 2026.
Right.
But geopolitics doesn't operate in tightly sealed, isolated chapters.
Not at all. So the suggestion is to integrate the analysis of these two crises to demonstrate how both superpowers are simultaneously exploiting distinct vulnerabilities to enforce their geopolitical red lines.
We have to see the theoretical tissue connecting the maritime security theater with the critical supply chain theater.
Exactly.
To me, it feels like the author is describing a hostage negotiation where both sides hold a completely different type of leverage. One has the physical key to the ocean, the other has the chemical key to the weapons.
That is a perfect systemic analysis.
So, how can the author seamlessly structure the synthesis so it doesn't just read like two completely separate articles spliced together?
Well, the author should explicitly link the fact that while the U.S. military controls the physical sea lanes in the Gulf through massive operations like Epic Fury,
Right.
China fundamentally dominates the processing of the rare earths required for the very U.S. defense systems enforcing that maritime control.
Oh, wow. Yeah. The F-15s flying combat air patrols over the Gulf, their targeting systems, their radar, their actuators, they all rely on materials currently being restricted by Beijing.
Exactly.
The U.S. controls the water, but China controls the alloys. I can see what you're going for here. Let's see how we can strengthen this. How do we weave this into a cohesive geopolitical theory?
By framing both events under a broader umbrella of supply chain weaponization. The author can illustrate how China's 2025 rare earth restrictions were basically the opening salvo. That move was a calculated demonstration of supply chain dominance, which fundamentally altered how the U.S. calculated its strategic risks when the Hormuz blockade occurred a year later.
The first event establishes the boundaries and the risk appetite for the second.
Exactly. And then the author can take it a step further by showing concrete examples, like how the newly established U.S. Board of Trade and the PTAP Annex are direct attempts to negotiate this specific dual choke point reality.
Right, those aren't just abstract trade policies.
No, they are direct, desperate attempts by Washington to build a resilient economic bloc precisely because they realize their physical military dominance is bottlenecked by China's chemical dominance.
It's an incredible dynamic. The hardware enforcing the Pax Americana is tethered to the supply chains of its primary adversary.
It's a huge paradox.
And elevating that paradox from a footnote into the central thesis transforms the text from a simple historical recap into a deeply sophisticated geopolitical risk analysis.
Absolutely.
All right, to swiftly recap the main points of our critique today. First, we recommend broadening the analytical scope to include the Global South's shifting allegiances. Second, we suggest reframing China's economic buffers as an asymmetric geopolitical advantage over an inflation-struck West.
Right.
And finally, synthesize the Hormuz and rare earth crises into a unified theory of dual choke point warfare.
The depth of research in this material is truly immense, and the foundation laid out here is incredibly strong. By pulling these intricate geopolitical threads together, the analysis will be absolute top tier.
We invite you to submit your revised work back in for more feedback. Remember, when you are analyzing global choke points, the tension doesn't just sit at the bottleneck, it radiates through the entire system.